Yeah. Well, the political commentator with Young Voices UK, Nathaniel Ogunniyi, is here to go through the stories with me. Nathaniel, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
Let's talk about that tension on the front page of the Daily Mail. They say Angela Rayner's radical workers' rights bill will soon scrap the 50% turnout threshold which unions must meet to hold legal strike action. Are the government potentially creating a bit of a rod for their own back?
Yes, I think there's a great risk that they are. So if you look at the Employment Rights Bill, which would scrap the 50% turnout threshold for industrial action, but then on the other side, ministers are saying that the 55% turnout that the BMA have for their strike action is low. So if 55% is too low, then surely you should be raising it instead of scrapping the 50% threshold for turnout you have already. And so there's a difficulty whereby on one side of the Labour Party, you have the more traditional trade unionists who stand in strong opposition to a lot of the reforms the last Conservative government brought in, especially around the 2016 Trade Union Act, which made it more difficult for unions to go on strike. There's one side of the Labour Party that has a lot of sympathy with getting rid of those restrictions and expanding the role of trade unions in employment relations disputes. And then on the other side, you have a bit of the Labour Party that understand if we consistently have doctors on strike, then waiting lists in the NHS will go up, and that makes it politically more difficult for you between now and the next election.
Yeah, I think the problem here for the government is that they were assuming there would be enough economic growth to cover rises that they promised to working people, and that now the sums don't add up. So strike action is looming in a way I think they didn't anticipate, and they can't, so they're saying, afford to pay people what they're demanding.
Yes, and so the difficulty is that Labour made a number of decisions immediately coming into office in terms of settling strikes. So when they came into office, they settled a number of strikes with teachers, with NHS workers, with train drivers, and the difficulty for them was that on a number of bases, they agreed a pay increase with no accompanying efficiency. And so if you're saying you'll pay people out of the public pocket more, then that money has to come from somewhere. And the difficulty for the Chancellor is, as you discussed with Terry a bit earlier, she's got these quite tight fiscal rules. And so it's difficult to see how she avoids tax rises in the autumn.
Yeah, well, let's look at the front page of the Daily Telegraph. The headline: tax raid looms for the middle classes. Middle class workers are going to face higher taxes this year. This is the suggestion from Heidi Alexander, the Transport Secretary. She said the government had promised not to increase taxes for people on modest incomes and that Labour would base its policy on fairness. I mean, what do you read from that?
Yeah, so I think this is a deliberate play for time. Heidi Alexander was asked about the discussions that happened at a cabinet away day on Friday, where senior ministers from the government sort of got together to discuss their plans for the coming years. But the difficulty is you can't announce a tax rise outside of a budget. Or at least Labour have pledged that they wouldn't do so. And so the difficulty here is that you will get questions for the next few months, all the way up until the autumn budget, saying, will you raise national insurance? Will you raise VAT? Will you raise this tax here, there, or the next? And ministers will be unable to answer them until the budget comes. And so there'll be this uncertainty, I think, hanging over a lot of people and their financial planning before that. We now see that the government have been looking at raising taxes on savings, including through restricting the ISA product and things like that. Then there seems to have been a U-turn on that ahead of the Mansion House speech later this week. So it's just difficult, I think. It's difficult because the government has sort of boxed themselves in with these quite tight fiscal rules, but with these quite tight promises around income tax, national insurance and VAT.
Yeah, they'd promised, hadn't they, not to raise the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax, employee national insurance or VAT. What we are expecting, Nathaniel, is that income tax thresholds will be frozen beyond the current deadline, which is 2028. So that will raise quite a lot of revenue and inevitably, I'm sure, cause some discontent.
Yes, so if you freeze the income tax threshold beyond 2028, then you sort of end up with what we call fiscal drag. So you drag people into higher tax brackets as they get salary increases. And so that raises about 8 to 10 billion in revenue annually. The difficulty for Rachel Reeves doing that is that she has, of course, previously criticised another previous Conservative governments for doing that. And so, if she was to press ahead with that move, I'm sure you'd find clips, or you'd find the Conservative Party cutting up clips of her previously saying that that was a stealth tax rise on workers.
Yeah, yeah, and it's back to that definition again that we talked about quite a bit in the general election campaign. Remember that, over a year ago now, about who working people are, because they've said they've promised they won't raise taxes for working people. And you think, well, is that everyone then, or not, or a select few? Let's move on. Ed Miliband is on the front page of The Guardian. He is going to explicitly call out politicians who reject net zero policies for betraying future generations. He's saying this is going to be an exercise in radical truth-telling. Who is he going to be targeting that at, do you think?
I think there's a clear target, not only for this attack from Ed Miliband, but from the majority of attacks we'll see from Labour over the coming year. I think those would all be targeted at reform. It's clear from the Morgan McSweeney, who's Keir Starmer's Downing Street Chief of Staff, but it's clear from his political strategy, as well as across government, that they see reform as the biggest target. And so I think the Energy Secretary is planning an annual statement to Parliament defending Labour's net zero policies and attacking those who are, in their opinion, denying the science or denying the scale of action required to tackle the issue. I think the difficulty that Ed Miliband will find here is that he is sort of speaking to the wrong audience. So he'll be making a statement, I think, in Parliament this time, but hopes to make it annually in defence of net zero and net zero policy. The difficulty, I think, is that the public more generally aren't opposed to net zero, but they are opposed to some of the means by which they want to get there. And so you may remember Rishi Sunak making a speech a while back about the whole 7 bins thing and restrictions on eating meat and things like that, further restrictions on flying. So I think the difficulty is that the statement that Ed Miliband may make in Parliament would actually be heard by a lot of reform supporters. And indeed, I think a key line that's been briefed out ahead of the Miliband speech is that he thinks anybody opposed to Labour's way of net zero is betraying future generations.
Yeah.
But I think he'll have a difficulty in prosecuting that argument because support for reform amongst young people is up. And so if you're saying that support for reform is betraying future generations, then are those future generations betraying themselves? Because a number of them are net zero skeptics too.
Yeah,
You
or
look at
they're not
support for reform,
listening.
it's up.
I mean, so the Met Office issued this report today saying extreme weather is the UK's new normal. So part of what Ed Miliband's going to say is that the British way of life as it currently exists is actually threatened without proper action. I mean, it sounds a bit like echoing the words we might have heard of Greta Thunberg, who used to be able to capture the hearts of young people. Do you remember when they all started striking off school on Fridays to protest for the climate? It will be very interesting to see how that speech is received a little bit later. It's going to be the State of the Climate address given to the Commons later by the Energy Secretary. So I will bring part of that to you here on Times Radio. Talking of young people and particularly their job applications, this may be some of your colleagues, Nathaniel, facing or contemporaries facing issues like this. The headline in The Guardian is Face to Face makes a comeback as job candidates turn to AI for applications. Teach First, a charity that sort of fast tracks graduates into teaching. You'll probably know lots of people who've done it. The number of people using AI, they say, has risen. Sorry, this is from the graduate employment specialist Bright Network. Say the number of people using AI for job applications has risen from 38% to 50% in the past 12 months. So companies like Teach First are saying, actually, written applications don't necessarily help us too much because the main skill it might be able to assess is how well you are able to leverage AI to improve your application.
Yes, so this is about the rise, as you say, of face-to-face interviews as people move away from written assessments. I think the difficulty with written assessments now, since the rise of ChatGPT and other AI services, is if you're trying to assess someone's writing, but you're not sure whether the writing was actually by them or by a large language model or AI system, then you're not really assessing the underlying individual. So you've got a much greater volume of applications since people have found it easier to apply for jobs like this because they just sort of copy and paste the questions from the job application into these systems and it gives them an answer. So you have a greater volume of applications, and the difficulty is you also have a falling graduate job market. So I think the article in The Guardian suggests that there's been a 32% fall in the number of junior and graduate jobs since ChatGPT was launched in 2022. So you have more applications going in for a fewer volume of jobs.
Yeah, but also many of those applications designed on AI. I think that's part of the problem. I mean, I would love to see face-to-face interviews rather than sort of applications that people are churning out and just getting them tailor-made via ChatGPT. But, obviously lots of different companies facing other pressures, and it's more efficient, of course, to get AI to sift through your first round of applications before you have to meet anyone. That'll be interesting. A bit more on that in the business news a little bit later. Front page of the Times, we should finish on this. Brie runs short after a soft cheese import ban. Nathaniel, what's happening?
Yeah, so I think border officials are turning soft cheese into hard work. But I think the difficulty, the article here suggests that due to a cattle outbreak in parts of France and Italy, which doesn't seem to have that much of an impact on cheese actually, but the UK has banned unpasteurized imports from both France and Italy since the middle of May. That has meant that a lot of cheeses have been out of stock in the UK, or at least that stocks have been running low. I think you'll find that's really inconvenient. But border officials from DEFRA have made it a bit more difficult to get these cheeses into the UK.
Yeah, brie particularly. There we go. So if you're struggling to get it in the supermarket, that might give you a clue why. Nathaniel, thank you very much going through the papers with me this morning. Nathaniel Ogunniyi.